Welcome, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for this much anticipated event. We are honoured and delighted to be presenting tonight for the first time the results of the inaugural Pandemic Gardening Survey. This survey was conducted from 15th of June to 15th of July this year by Sustain on behalf of the 8 organisations that comprise the steering committee for the 3rd National Urban Agriculture Forum, which is taking place on 23rd to 24th of April 2021, and the inaugural Urban Agriculture Month taking place for the whole of April 2021. The motivation for conducting this survey stemmed from experiences of community gardeners during the first COVID-19 lockdown, several of whom had been told that they were not allowed to continue gardening during the period the restrictions were in place. Naomi Lacey wrote to every state and territory health minister, as well as the federal health minister, seeking clarification about the status of community gardening during COVID-19 restrictions, and in particular, confirmation that community gardening would be viewed as an essential and therefore permitted activity. In addition, we were aware from media reports that nurseries were selling out of seeds and seedlings, and that, with so many people at home, people were spending more time edible gardening or taking it up for the first time. We were also aware that the advent of the pandemic itself, together with the restrictions and drastic curtailment of economic and social activity, were having a significant impact on people's mental health and sense of well-being. So before going forward, just want to give a very big and warm thank you to Costa Georgiadis, the Diggers Club, and the members of the Urban Agriculture Steering Committee, all of whom helped us obtain such a fabulous response to this survey. And most of all, a huge thank you to Pooja Malya and Anna Spataru, who spent literally days, if not weeks of their time over the past couple of months working with myself and Kelly, analysing the results so that we can share them with you this evening. In tonight's presentation, we will share with you the hundreds of hours of work we've engaged in since the survey closed in mid-July, analysing over 9,000 responses. We've organised the findings into the following chapters: an executive summary, demographics, gardeners and gardening, the pandemic experience, selected gardener profiles, key emerging themes, and reflections and recommendations. The last section is very preliminary, as we will be going into much more depth and detail in terms of an action agenda to support urban agriculture and edible gardening in our next webinar, which is taking place on Friday, the 9th of October. So the purpose of this survey was essentially twofold. Firstly, to take the pulse, so to speak, of the experience of Australians during these extraordinary months of the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions, with a particular focus on edible gardening activities and their significance. And secondly, to use the results to make the case for greater recognition of and support for activities that we already know are of great value and meaning for many, many thousands of us. This is what we can report by way of high-level findings. First, the pandemic has been hugely disruptive for many people, but it has also been a time of great reflection, with many feeling that the potential for transformative change is much closer than it has been for a very long time. Secondly, a frequently recurring theme was the increased sense of time many respondents reported, leading to more, and for many people, much more time in their gardens. Thirdly, edible gardening makes a major difference to people's sense of mental health and well-being. Fourthly, for many respondents, it has allowed them to maintain social connections and in some cases establish new connections. Next, for those on low incomes, edible gardening is much more than a hobby. It makes a major contribution to their household food budgets. 45% of those growing more than 30% of their own food had household incomes under $50,000 per annum, which is the poverty line for a family of 4 in Australia. And finally, while 98% of respondents want to continue and or expand their food growing activities, more than a quarter say they need help to do so, with access to advice and mentoring being the most frequently mentioned need. Key themes that came through strongly included great concern about noticeable trends towards increasing inequality and hardship for vulnerable and marginalised members of the Australian and global communities. While for many this caused considerable anxiety about the future, this sentiment was balanced by large numbers of other respondents who noted the many positives to emerge from the pandemic. In particular, increased community connectedness, a deeper appreciation of what really matters in life, and greater awareness of the urgent need for change. There was an overwhelming response to this survey. We were absolutely blown away by that, both in terms of the sheer number of respondents, as you can see there, 9,140, and in terms of the depth and detail that people expressed in sharing their experiences, their perspectives, and their lives in over 25,000 comments, some of which ran to 200 words long. We are enormously grateful to everyone who completed the survey, because collectively they have made a powerful statement in support of edible gardening and urban agriculture in Australia, and especially in the new reality that 2020 has brought forward. These were three of many similar comments from respondents who expressed their appreciation of the effort we have undertaken to conduct the survey, analyse and share the results and key messages. This first comment in particular captured this sentiment. I'm so glad, this gentleman from Adelaide says, that somebody is recording this awakening. I feel that gardening keeps me in touch with the basics of our existence. It reminds me that the complexities of life can sometimes just require observation and interaction. It reminds me that the graciousness of life is abundant. These are qualities learnt in a garden. Now we'll quickly provide the key demographic information reflecting those who completed the survey. As you can see here, in terms of age, while every generation was represented in this survey, the majority of respondents were over the age of 45. The ethnic and cultural background of respondents broadly reflected the wider Australian community, as revealed by the National Census. On the other hand, respondents collectively had a lower household income compared to the national average of $117,000 per annum. That's from 2018, with more than 70% of respondents from households with an annual income below that figure. Approximately a quarter of respondents reported a household income below $50,000 per annum, which is, as I mentioned before, the poverty line for a family of four in Australia. We will return in some detail to respondents from low-income households and the significance of edible gardening for them later in the presentation. Respondents were overwhelmingly female. It's difficult to draw conclusions from this as to whether Australian gardeners are actually predominantly women or whether women were more likely to respond to a survey such as this. However, it is worth noting that globally, women are the majority of the world's small farmers, and that, by the measure of local and regional food systems, women produce most of the world's food, as distinct from bulk traded agricultural commodities. As you can see by the map of the country, this survey achieved excellent national geographic coverage. 62% of all postcodes in Australia and 29% of the country's total landmass are represented by the 9,140 respondents to this survey. Though the majority of respondents were concentrated in urban areas, there were nonetheless a good representation from regional, rural and remote parts of the country. Within the city themselves, there was wide postcode representation, as we'll see now by having a closer look at Tasmania, Victoria, and New South Wales. So here we can see the island of Tasmania, and you see there the dispersal of respondents clustered around the major urban conurbations of Hobart, Launceston, Devonport, and Burnie. And then in Hobart itself, you see respondents dispersed through most parts of the city. Moving to Victoria, which had 42% of the total number of respondents to this survey, 3,618 in total. We see here virtually from every part of the state, we have respondents to this survey, with the major clusters, as one would expect, around metropolitan Melbourne, going down to Geelong and the Surf Coast, out west to Ballarat and to the Central Goldfields and Bendigo, and also up the Hume Highway towards Albury, Wodonga, and further out east to Gippsland. And then if we look at Melbourne, again, as one might expect, the largest concentrations being in the inner north suburbs of Brunswick, Northcote, Thornbury, Preston, but a fairly wide geographic dispersal across the arc of suburbs, going from the southeast to the east to the northeast, northwest and out to the west as well. And then finally, on this little tour of the country, we will have a look at New South Wales, which accounted for nearly a quarter of all respondents to the survey. And you can see there from the south coast up through Sydney to the central coast and up to the mid-north coast and the far north coast, and then going into the central west and even the far west of New South Wales, there are respondents. And if we look at Sydney itself, we can see many parts of the city are represented in terms of the dispersal of the respondents. So now we're going to look at gardeners and gardening, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kelly Donati.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for that fantastic introduction to the survey. So this next section will deal with some of the who the gardeners are gardening with and how much and what they're growing. Questions about people's gardening experience reveal that over half of respondents have more than 10 years experience with gardening. In this presentation, we've described those gardeners as experienced gardeners, while we describe those gardening for under 1 year or since COVID as new gardeners. In our presentation on 9th of October, we'll look at their experience of these new gardeners in a bit more detail. Suffice to say that this tends to be a much younger cohort of gardeners who are calling for more support in the form of knowledge, mentoring, and training. Almost half of all gardeners were growing less than 10% of their own food, but more than a third were growing between 10 and 30%. And the remaining 14 were growing a lot of their own food. And we'll look a little bit later at who this demographic was represented by, broadly speaking. When it comes to productivity, experience definitely matters. The most experienced gardeners, that is those who were gardening for more than 10 years, were twice as likely to be growing 30% or more of their own food compared to new gardeners, which is what this graph is comparing here. A theme that emerged from the comments was that skills and knowledge are very important in feeding oneself or one's household. A since COVID gardener in Adelaide comments on how developing the skills to grow her own food has been empowering for her and her family. And she writes, our family realized how important it is to have the skills to grow our own food if need be. We are learning from scratch how to do so. We feel incredibly liberated as we acquire food growing knowledge and plan on doing much more in the future. Another new gardener, however, writes that it is easy to get discouraged without strong food growing knowledge. And she says, I think people who've been gardening for ages underestimate how difficult it is to know where to start and how overwhelming it can be. There is a sense of assumed knowledge, things like seasonal planting, companion plants, how much room to give, how much water, pruning, where to plant, how to prepare soil, etc. that is often learned through trial and error by the beginner. This means that time and money invested often ends up with a poorly performing patch, and it is very easy to get discouraged. Gardeners around the country are growing a huge diversity of food which enriches their diet. Over and above the fruit and veg that one would expect gardeners to be producing, over a quarter were raising poultry for eggs. A small portion were raising their own meat and even fish. And the average gardener was growing over 7 different categories of foods. And we'll look at some of those categories in the following slides. So here, these figures represent the total number of growers who are growing vegetables. That is to say, of those growing vegetables, 94% are growing leafy greens, 89% herbs, 71% legumes in the form of peas and beans, and so on. We conducted this survey in mid-June to July, so we would expect that a summertime survey would have shown more people growing fruiting vegetables such as tomatoes and eggplants. The moral of the story here is that gardening is a great way to ensure that one is eating a diverse range of greens and other veg, but obviously outstanding freshness and flavor is often an even greater incentive than health for many gardeners. Fruit trees were also very popular, with 90% growing either tree fruit or tropical fruit, and berries and vines were also common. Here we start to see the rather surprising range of other foods that people were reporting either gardening, raising, foraging, or even hunting. Beekeeping, growing flowers for eating or for pollinators, mushrooms, nuts, native foods, and medicinal plants were some of the more commonly reported foods under the category of other. And these numbers here are frequencies rather than percentages. Gardeners reported growing everything from sprouts and microgreens on their windowsills to mushrooms under their laundry sinks. As we can see from these comments, not only did respondents report that gardening gave them a sense of control during a stressful time, but they also grew medicinal plants for their health, and in some cases, as a way of deepening their connection to culture. People also reported the joy that comes from observing or interacting with bees or chickens. So the benefits of this great diversity of food clearly go beyond merely questions of nutrition. As one gardener in Victoria writes, "We already have 2 beehives and we have morning and afternoon tea watching them. It's been a sanity saver. The chooks are entertaining and the bees are addictive." Another gardener from South Sydney writes, "I definitely want to grow more medicinal herbs, especially native herbs. I'm Indigenous and I feel this is an area that I would love to explore at home as an option other than returning back to country." So now I'll move on to how people described their experience of the pandemic itself and what gardening meant to them during these uncertain times. We wanted to understand, firstly, what impact the pandemic had on people. As one might expect, almost half of respondents reported feeling anxious and worried. Not surprisingly, a quarter felt isolated or alone. 21% lost work or income. Interestingly, although we were in the middle of a global pandemic, only 13% described a decrease in physical health. More than a quarter actually reported improved physical health. Many people attributed this to having more time to take care of themselves. And these numbers here are frequencies of some of the qualitative analysis. So respondents in the comment section of this question went into a lot more detail about their experience of the pandemic. There were well over 3,000 comments about people having more time, and many went on to describe spending this time in the garden, taking up new hobbies or other creative pursuits. Having more time to spend with family also featured quite strongly. The sense of time to focus on things that matter perhaps explains the 2,000 comments from folks who actually felt happier during the pandemic, even amongst those who had lost work or income. It should be noted, however, that people obviously had very different experiences of the pandemic, particularly for those for whom work actually intensified. This respondent from Bowral, New South Wales, enjoyed how the pandemic meant spending more meaningful time with her family. Another from Castlemaine, Victoria, said that she had less money but was happier and healthier, even with a reduction in work and income. However, given the recent upending of the higher education sector, this academic from Sydney would certainly not be unique in commenting that the effects of the pandemic have been stressful and exhausting, with additional work, less certainty, and more anxiety about the future. A common sentiment, however, was having time to focus on what really matters. Other gardeners, such as this one in Northeast Victoria, reported spending more meaningful time with her partner. An unexpected number of respondents spoke of their experience recovering from cancer and how the shutdown gave them the time that they would have not otherwise taken to properly rest and recover. She writes, "I have recently completed treatment for cancer. The shutdown has made me do the right thing and rest. Without the shutdown, I feel I would have tried to carry on as usual." This speaks to the fact that although the pandemic has created many uncertainties, it has made possible for some a letting go of a more hurried lifestyle. Indeed, what the respondents of this survey reveal is a great imbalance between the pressures of and time dedicated to our working lives compared to the time that is needed to maintain one's health, one's relationships, or even, in this case, to recover from a life-threatening illness. This was by no means an isolated comment. For us, this only reinforces the need for a fundamental rethink of how time and health are valued in our society and our economy. One gardener from Perth noted, having the time and space to do some meaningful thinking has led to a radical shift in priorities, and he's taken the decision to acquire a farm. So the garden moves people in many ways. We asked folks to tell us how long they typically spent gardening per week. Almost half spent 1 to 5 hours a week in the garden. Over a quarter spent 5 to 10 hours a week. Only 9% spent less than an hour in the garden per week, and about 15% were diehard gardeners, spending more than 10 hours a week in the garden. So, did the pandemic lead to more gardening, more edible gardening? And the short answer is yes. More than 60% of respondents noted that the pandemic resulted in them spending a lot or a bit more time in the garden. Just over a third said they spent about the same time in the garden, with a fraction stating that the pandemic actually caused them to reduce time spent in the garden. A common sentiment expressed by gardeners was that the pandemic allowed people to increase the productivity and diversity of their garden. This gardener in Melbourne notes that more time in the garden meant more composting, more seed germination, and more planting, all of which resulted in more food. Another gardener near Broken Hill trebled the size of his garden and increased its diversity. He now produces 80% of his own vegetables plus excess for others. Another gardener in Perth commented on feeling a greater sense of control over their food, purchasing some extra quail to supply their household. Gardening was clearly very important to people during the pandemic, and this was regardless of age or household incomes of the gardeners. Although 20% of people, almost 20% of people felt they could not have made it through the pandemic without their garden. Another 62% stated that the garden meant a great deal to them during this time. Only 2% said that they could take or leave the garden. So we believe these are powerful figures that are supported by people's extensive comments in relation to this question. A gardener in the west of Melbourne commented that the garden gave her hope, peace, and purpose, and that it had a therapeutic quality, a sentiment that was shared by many other gardeners. A gardener in the south coast of New South Wales said that her garden reinforced her personal resilience and redirected her fear and anxiety into action during the pandemic. A central purpose of the survey was to explore the link between edible gardening and mental health. A whopping 72% commented that the garden greatly or significantly improves their mental health, and only 3% said that the garden made very little difference to them. Interestingly, the age group that most strongly expressed the link between gardening and mental health was the 18 to 24 age bracket. And although we didn't include the figures here, 53% of respondents in this age group said gardening greatly improved their mental health, compared to 38% of all gardeners. Interestingly, young people also reported the greatest increase in time spent gardening during the pandemic. The benefits of gardening for mental health are consistently reported in other research, so in some ways, these findings come as no surprise. However, what was surprising were the often quite moving stories that gardeners shared with us. This gardener in Geelong reflected on how gardening held her together after losing a loved one during the pandemic. She writes that, "My mother passed away in March, and watching things grow, helping them into the world, has been enormously comforting. In a year where things felt like they've been put on pause, the inexorable growth of our vegetables has been a sweet and quiet lesson in motion, a sense of things carrying on." Others spoke about how the garden brings a calm and a focus on the future. A female gardener in New South Wales described how the garden brought her peace, happiness, comfort, generosity, connections, health, and nourishment. So clearly the benefits of gardening for mental health operate on many different levels, and perhaps this is what makes growing one's own food such a powerful and empowering act. We were interested to see how the benefits of gardening on mental health had a kind of dual effect. Firstly, gardening served to reduce negative feelings such as stress and anxiety, or to ease the effects of physical illness. This gardener in Brisbane writes, "It has changed my life after years of grief and illness. I'm doing it to help me mentally and physically. I have severe arthritis and fibromyalgia, yet somehow the pandemic motivated me to set goals after the initial period of worry and isolation. Now I have plans and projects for the future and have achieved much in spite of the physical challenges and setbacks." Conversely, gardening brings positive feelings such as happiness and tranquility. This gardener in Melbourne describes how powerfully restorative the garden is for her mental health. She writes, "My garden is my church. For a woman with a history of mental health challenges and supporting a family and husband with terminal cancer in his early 50s, my garden has been a way back to a happy, healthy state of mind. I'm back." A similar sentiment is expressed by this gardener in Perth, who explains that the garden allows him to focus on the senses, encourages him to move around more, to eat more healthily, to become a better cook, with the overall effect of reducing his sense of anxiety. A low-income gardener in Queensland explains that the garden is a happy place for her autistic son. Another gardener living with cancer describes how the garden keeps her alive, especially on the bad days. She writes, "My greatest joy is seeing my grandchildren fossick through it, eating as they go. For me, keeping the garden going in times of stress is a way of asserting some control over my life and establishing and maintaining some normality while the world spins out of control." And so edible gardening is not only about reducing negative emotions, but actively cultivates happiness, joy, and a sense of purpose and control over one's life. This theme resonated amongst people who described living with post-traumatic stress disorder. Although we did not specifically ask about this, many people volunteered sentiments about the therapeutic nature of gardening, describing its healing effect on their minds and bodies. Here, a firefighter in regional Victoria describes the garden as a balm for his soul. Another describes struggling with PTSD going into the pandemic, finding the connection with her garden therapeutic. A third gardener struggling with PTSD in Western Sydney writes about gardening as healing and life-saving. Yet another gardener here struggling with her health reports that the garden helped her cope with anxiety during lockdown and gave her a sense that she was making a meaningful contribution. A gardener in South Gippsland expressed frustration that politicians focus on economic growth over things that actually benefit people. She reports that her health has been so improved by gardening that she's returned back to work after a period of ill health. We appreciate how readily people opened up to us about these very personal struggles and what the garden has meant to them during this difficult time. We also feel they reveal something about how the benefits of edible gardening cut across so many segments of the community, including many who are living under challenging circumstances. People did a range of things with the bounty of their garden. As one would expect 93% consumed it within their household. However, 3/4 also shared it with family and friends. Preserving their bounty was reported by almost half, and 21% swapped it with others. A small fraction reported selling it. However, of the 420 people who reported other, 23% of them gave the food to other people or people other than family and friends. And this included, in some cases, local businesses or food relief organizations. 12% of them fed animals, and an additional 16% of them were still waiting for to harvest their food. Not surprisingly, the abundance of the garden has meant different things to different people and connected people in different ways. For a gardener in Geelong, the garden has been a heartwarming and joyful way of interacting with neighbors, which has resulted from her Grow Free cart that she left in front of her house. A low-income gardener in Albany, WA, buys fewer vegetables but enjoys cooking with fresher and more flavorsome ingredients. Again, flavor featured very strongly amongst many gardeners. Another low-income gardener shared a sentiment that resonated with many other people. That is to say, produce from the garden was a way of avoiding the shops and therefore reducing her risk of contracting the virus, whilst also increasing her intake of fresh veg, sharing with others, and increasing her sense of community, even while socially distancing. This was a very common theme, which we'll see emerge in other comments. Gardening is a solitary activity for most people, and yet, somewhat ironically, a recurring theme was how people appreciated the connections that gardening creates for them. Front yard gardeners commented on enjoying the social contact that comes from chatting with passers-by. As the gardeners in the previous slide suggest, many people created connections by putting excess produce out in front of their homes or swapping with others. For 36% of respondents, gardening is a more social activity. Of this group of gardeners, people most commonly gardened with their partners, with their parents and grandparents, children and grandchildren, and other gardeners, perhaps in a community garden. A small portion of people garden with neighbors, friends, housemates, and other family. These figures here refer to the percentage of those who selected other. These reported gardening with volunteers, co-workers, and even their students. Some reported hiring a gardener to help them, and an equal number, including myself, reported dogs and chooks as important companions in the garden. Here are just a few examples that illustrate how people felt connected to others through gardening. One gardener in Adelaide writes, "Although I garden alone, during COVID-19, knowledge sharing about vegetable growing and seed and seedling swaps have also been an important part of my ISO socializing." A young gardener in Frankston says, I garden with my online community. We talk about what we're growing, throwing ideas around to help each other, etc. An experienced female gardener in Port Macquarie writes, since my husband and I garden in the front lawn, more people were at home during the daytime. I met many more of my distant neighbors. I had several people stop in for a chat over the fence. My more elderly neighbors have gained confidence and began growing a few things in their backyard to swap with us.
So,
Go ahead.
so thanks so much, Kelly, for taking us through all the rich detail and depth that this survey has generated. I'm sure that's provoked an enormous amount of reflection and hopefully some questions and inspiration amongst everybody watching this presentation. And of course, with our fellow panelists, Costa Georgiadis and Naomi Lacey, I'm sure you've got a lot of reflections and observations to share with us following what Kelly has just shared. So over to you guys now to share some of your thoughts with us for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Well, thanks so much, Costa and Naomi. That was a absolutely fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for sharing those really great insights with us. Now we're going to move into the second part of our presentation, and I'm going to hand back to Kelly, who's going to continue by looking in some more detail at some selected gardener profiles. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so this next section, as Nick mentioned, is focusing on some particular types of gardeners that we thought would be interesting to look at in a little bit more detail. As we know, Australia is now officially in its first recession for 30 years, and hundreds of thousands of people have lost work or income. This comes after 4 decades in which income and wealth inequality has been increasing, both within Australia and globally. Reports from frontline emergency food relief agencies suggest that there has already been surging demand for their services, and this is expected to increase sharply once this job seeker supplement and the job keeper subsidies are wound back starting next month. There are thousands of people at significant risk of food insecurity and even homelessness in the months to come. For all of these reasons and more, we were particularly concerned in this survey to understand the importance of edible gardens for households with incomes on or below the poverty line of $50,000 per annum. It's worth remembering that one of the best ways, and certainly one of the most dignified and delicious ways, to guarantee one's food security is to grow your own food. So what did the survey reveal? Firstly, that low-income households tend to be older, with 74% of respondents being over the age of 55, and 50% being over 60. Secondly, and most importantly, in terms of the vital question of food insecurity or food security, low-income gardeners grow significantly more food than higher household income brackets. This pie chart shows the breakdown by income of those gardeners growing more than 30% of their own food. So these are the most productive gardeners and how they are broken down by income. So 45% of the most productive gardeners have a household income of under 50,000. This is nearly 3 times as much as the next bracket up, 50 to 75. As people's household incomes go up, the less likely they are to be growing significant quantities of their own food. So this might challenge some assumptions about home gardening in Australia, in which it is seen as a hobby or leisure pursuit for those with the means to finance it. As we said earlier, experience matters when it comes to productivity. We also know that these experienced gardeners tend to be an older demographic perhaps pensioners who may, in some cases, have low income but possibly be asset rich. However, even when we removed the over 65s from the equation, a third of the most productive gardeners still had the lowest household incomes. Either way, we think that these figures represent an enormous opportunity. As we'll see later, the new gardeners were the most likely to state that they needed support in the form of knowledge and mentoring. On the other hand, older gardeners were more likely to say that they needed an extra pair of hands. Many of these pensioners would have a huge wealth of knowledge that could be potentially shared with younger gardeners, and we feel that this is something that local councils could explore at a local level. For those of us fortunate enough to have above average incomes, we might think of edible gardening as something that is important for all kinds of reasons, but not necessarily in terms of food security. However, these comments suggest otherwise. This comment from a gardener in Gippsland says that she needed to isolate for health reasons, and that the garden helped her stretch her budget. She says single income, a family of 4 with one being an adult with a disability, not working, no choice but to grow our own food to make the budget work and eat well. We never go out. We are self-sufficient in vegetables and fruit. Another gardener talks about how the garden helped stretch the budget and that they found benefits from swapping food and plants. One outside of Hobart says that being able to garden and have some food security means everything to our small family. It allowed her to tackle family life with a healthier mental and physical state, less risk in terms of going to the supermarket. Our community is happier and much closer now, and they've started swapping vegetables and resources. Another way of representing this data is to compare the number of highly productive gardeners at the highest and lowest income levels. The importance of edible gardening for fundamental food security and healthy food is reinforced by the fact that 20% of low-income households are growing more than 30% of their own food, compared to 9% of households earning over $150,000 a year. As this experienced female gardener from the outskirts of Melbourne says, "I'm secure in the knowledge that I have some fresh food to eat if I cannot afford to buy it, as the price of fresh food continues to increase rapidly." There are concerns that one of the impacts of COVID-19 restrictions will be price rises in fresh food due to supply chain disruptions. Similarly, an experienced gardener in Hobart states that they rely on their garden for most of their own food, owing to their limited income. I believe this is a common experience, and it is alone a powerful reason for governments at all levels to support and enable edible gardening much more than they currently do. It comes as no surprise that the pandemic presented particular challenges to people living on their own. Again, here the garden delivers. For a gardener in Central Coast New South Wales living alone with Parkinson's, the garden keeps her busy, keeps her physically active, but also busy during a time that was potentially lonely. A low-income gardener in Outer Melbourne comments that her garden has led to more friendly chats with her neighbor. Here, a widow states quite powerfully that the garden has been her source of sanity, and that without it, she would not have survived. Another gardener, though lonely in lockdown, embraces the gift of solitude, pleasure, and rare stillness that the garden brings. We take these as powerful accounts of just how much gardening has meant to another segment of the community that has been potentially very vulnerable during the lockdown period. On a more upbeat note, front yard gardening was one way of making urban food production visible to the rest of the neighborhood and either sharing produce or gardening with others. So this was another cohort that we identified. And they were particularly enthusiastic about the benefits of gardening in their front yard as a way of connecting with neighbors, creating more resilient communities. In the past few weeks and months, there has been a rising awareness of the challenges and difficulties of prolonged social isolation during the COVID-19 restrictions, and we don't know yet what the medium and long-term effects of ongoing social distancing will be. As a result, there's been a lot of focus on practices and initiatives that can build and retain social connections, especially in Victoria. And as these comments show, front yard gardening is a fantastic means of COVID-safe socializing and connection. As this young female gardener in Melbourne comments, connecting with neighbors through front yard gardening and having over the fence chats has greatly helped during these isolating times. I think encouraging the community to plant on verges and dabble in front yard gardening is a wonderfully powerful thing to do. In a similar vein, a new and younger gardener in Sydney talks about shares how establishing their veggie patch in the front yard made them better connected to their community and prevented isolation and loneliness. Similarly, an experienced gardener from Melbourne's southern metro region states quite proudly, the old paradigm has failed again, and a system that relies on consuming more and more imported goods and foods is not a sustainable economy. Start the people's rebuild, build it fair, grow it fresh, and grow it local. We are proud front yard farmers. Many who don't have access to front yards, for whatever reason, expressed desire to garden on their verges. However, there was much frustration with councils that prohibited them from doing so. And this is more about on the presentation on the 9th of October. But here I'll hand over to Nick to take a closer look at some of the key themes and some of the major themes emerging from the survey.
So thanks very much, Kelly, for taking us through those really fascinating profiles of gardeners living alone, front yard gardeners, and low-income gardeners. On the 9th of October, we'll also be taking a look at another demographic amongst gardeners, renters, and there's a series of particular issues that arise for them that we'll explore on the 9th of October. In the last two sections now of this evening's presentation, we'll take a closer look at some of the key and major themes to emerge from this survey. We wanted in this survey to explore with respondents their feelings and thoughts about the future. So we asked them to what extent they agreed or disagreed with this statement. The COVID-19 pandemic has created possibilities for a better, fairer, and more sustainable society. I feel hopeful about the future. We can say with some confidence that the majority of respondents agreed strongly with the proposition that the events of 2020 have indeed created possibilities for positive change, with over 70%, as you can see there, either agreeing, strongly agreeing, or somewhat agreeing. A small but significant minority, however, disagreed or strongly disagreed, with the prevailing view amongst these respondents being that the pandemic has fully revealed already existing inequalities and that it will make that trend worse or much worse. We must also point out, as you can see there in that green circle, that around 900 of those who agreed with the first part of the statement went on to qualify their response by saying that while they agreed about possibilities for change, they had little or no confidence that those possibilities would actually be realised. So they couldn't agree that they felt hopeful about the future. Respondents expressed many feelings and opinions about the future, from positivity and hopefulness to despair and sadness. Some recurrent comments included the following: that the opportunities that the disruption has created will be lost in the rush to return to normal. A resignation that things won't change because of corrupt government, corporations, and/or human nature. That some were more hopeful in the first lockdown and less so in the second. That it's too early to say. It will depend on whether people maintain the lifestyle and other changes they have made, including taking up edible gardening. That we need to move much faster because there is so much work to do if we want a fairer, more sustainable, and better future. That any changes will require work and effort. They won't come easily. And finally, that this year offers the potential for a total societal reboot or reset, as some respondents put it, if we take the opportunity. So several respondents regarded the pandemic as, as they put it, an urgent alarm to change what we have accepted as normal, as we can see in that first quote there from this gardener in Coles Bay in Tasmania. What is required, in her view, is a paradigm shift from economic well-being that needs to be replaced by earth well-being. Reminding us of how the Chinese word for crisis is comprised of the characters that represent danger and opportunity, this experienced gardener from Ballarat, in the second quote, expressed the hope that governments have the courage and imagination to make some good come from a dreadful situation and use these events to reshape the world in a positive way. Reflecting a common sentiment, this experienced gardener from Sydney, in the third quote, lamented that not enough of us are awake to walk the path, and the better path that the pandemic has revealed is open to us. Time, having more of it, and what that enabled and provoked was a major theme emerging from the survey, as we have noted previously. Comments in this vein included the following: the extra time and slowing down of life has allowed people to evaluate what's important and what matters. Having more time makes people embrace more sustainable ways of living. Having more time allows people to grow more of their own food. Additional time and time spent at home enables a better work-life balance. Similarly, the extra time has allowed lost arts and practices, such as cooking, to be rediscovered. The extra time also has health and quality of life implications, as the second comment on this slide reflects. And this final comment from an experienced gardener of the Mornington Peninsula also points to the paradigm shift that many respondents are calling for. She says, life is not just about work, commuting to work, or squeezing in the rest of life on the weekends. I hope the slowing down that has allowed other values to rise, community connectedness, kindness, generosity, etc., will continue to be seen as important. A step away from the focus on endless growth as the only economic model and competition as the only way to view ourselves and each other will hopefully start to fade away. Treating each other and the natural world only as resources to be consumed can no longer be countenanced as a way forward. Respect for each other and the natural world needs to be front and centre. A recurring theme mentioned by hundreds of respondents was the fact that the burden of the restrictions imposed in the wake of the pandemic fell most heavily on those least able to deal with them. That is, those with less financial resources and those with insecure housing and employment. This comment from a gardener in Brisbane reflects that sentiment. She says, it's made racism rise up. It feels awful to have some people with a lot and super greedy, and some with nothing, no food, no roof, and nowhere to turn. Some have even slept in our garden. Similarly, a gardener from Goolwa in South Australia expressed a commonly held view when she said, our food system is daily destroying our environment. And finally, this gardener in Port Macquarie noted how in many other parts of the world, provision is explicitly made for members of low-income households to have access to spaces to grow their own food. Bearing in mind what we said earlier about the food security implications of edible gardening, this has important policy implications, we believe, for local and state governments. Similar sentiments were expressed by other respondents. For example, an experienced gardener from Adelaide said this: at first, especially as I saw seed and plant suppliers sell out of stock, I felt really hopeful that this would be a catalyst for long-term structural change. I am a social educator and see producing one's own food as a rejection of capitalism, a sense of responsibility to the health of the planet and a way to reclaim autonomy. However, I've also seen a huge rise in the use of single-use plastics, a pushback from vested interests, and a sense that people still care more about the individual than the collective. I am hoping that there can be an organised and sustained push for community rather than top-down government responses to social and world problems for the sake of my children. For so many people in Australia and globally, this has been a time of hardship and suffering, of loss and grief, of fear and anxiety. In previous times in history, a profound systemic and structural challenge, there is a very real and serious danger of increasing division and the politics of division. For those reasons, it is, in our view, essential to discover and rediscover what connects us, what we share, what we have in common, not just with our fellow humans, but with all forms of life on Earth. In a time of enforced isolation, the work of social connection is vital. The recovery from COVID-19 requires that. But to meet the challenges of ecological devastation and the climate emergency, we need to do much more. We must rediscover and deepen our connection to nature. And how better to begin that work than through the age-old practice of gardening, of growing our own food, of observing and watching and drinking in the miracle of life, as this female gardener from out of Perth expresses beautifully with these words. I grow for the pleasure of producing as much of our food as I can. The connection to nature, the opportunity to observe the biodiversity in our patch, the opportunity to observe how my edibles respond to the soil conditions, climate, visiting pests and helpers, the opportunity to observe insects, birds and other animals, watching my fruit trees through the season. Similarly, as this gardener from the Sunshine Coast writes, the root of so many of the ills of modern life stem from the sense and experience of alienation and disconnection that it generates and perpetuates. For her, the pathway back is through gardening, which, as she says, reconnects with the earth, and in that reconnection, there will be feelings of taking care of the soil and so taking care of the body. This gardener from Melbourne speaks movingly and powerfully of connection with the plants and trees in her garden, of how they provide more than food, Indigenous plants used by an Indigenous person. And we'll give the final word here to another experienced Melburnian gardener. She says, this pandemic has highlighted how connected we all are, and how those of us in more affluent regions of the world have greater responsibility to live more gently on this earth. Working in a garden is really the first step in becoming open to learning about the fragility of our planet and the importance of making choices that do not damage it. Our priorities need to be seriously re-examined. Connecting to nature through the nurturing of a garden will awaken us to what needs to be addressed now. As mentioned, on the 9th of October, we're going to present in more depth and detail what we have gleaned from the massive response to this survey as positive pathways forward. What we offer in this concluding section this evening are some high-level conclusions, reflections, and recommendations, which we hope will offer inspiration and ideas for everyone watching to take from this webinar to your gardening practice, be that in your own private space or in public spaces, or both. So we'll begin this final part of the presentation by returning to the survey data. 98% of the 9,140 people answering this survey said that they plan to continue their edible gardening activities, with many saying they plan to very substantially increase those activities. When asked if they had enough support, 74%, as you can see there, said yes, but a substantial minority said they required additional support. So in terms of the additional support that 26% were asking for, the most commonly expressed need was for knowledge, advice, mentoring, and guidance. It's worth noting that over 70% of new gardeners expressed this as their greatest need. This was followed by inputs and materials such as seeds and compost. Third was access to land, followed by financial support, and then tools and equipment. Finally, several gardeners mentioned physical assistance, which is especially important for persons living with mobility challenges or disabilities. There were many valuable suggestions and ideas put forward by respondents, and here is a small selection. A male gardener from Northwest Tasmania made the excellent suggestion of the formation of urban agriculture cooperatives, which would, as he put it, enable sharing of knowledge and skills, shared ownership of larger or more specialised tools, and the bulk purchasing of materials such as green manure and seed. This would be especially valuable for gardeners from low-income households, as would subsidised seeds and seedlings, more community gardens and food swaps, as suggested by an experienced gardener from Alice Springs. A Melburnian gardener identified a key role for local governments to make relatively small investments in the provision of seed libraries and free mulch, as well as identifying public open space that can be made into food forests or community gardens. She made the wonderful suggestion of a library of things. 3,190 respondents left comments about how edible gardening could be further supported. Qualitative analysis allowed us to categorise these comments into the following major classes of recommendations. As we've mentioned, we'll explore these in more detail on the 9th of October. Access to land is especially important, particularly as we've heard many times tonight for those on low incomes. There is clearly a role for local government to play regarding streamlining and speeding up approvals for community gardens and similar productive uses of urban space, as a gardener from Perth comments here. In addition, it is not just a question of land use, but also of how that land is managed. Spraying of pesticides disadvantages those who forage edible weeds, like this experienced gardener from Sydney. Education is also critical. At Sustain, we are huge believers that food literacy, including edible gardening, should be a core part of our educational system. We agree with this younger gardener from Sydney that there is a clear role for councils to play in helping communities learn about growing their own food. There was a very strong sentiment in favour of many more public edible spaces. Community gardens were mentioned 3,000 times throughout the survey, with hundreds of mentions for edible verges, parks and streetscapes. So we see here a gardener from out of Melbourne calling for edible nature strips, a young gardener from Sydney saying that edible gardens anywhere possible would help communities, and a since COVID gardener from the ACT asking for the establishment of community orchards. Support for verge gardens also came from a younger male gardener in eastern Melbourne who made the link between a severe economic downturn and the challenge of food security. An experienced gardener from northern Melbourne also embraced a vision of a much more edible and thriving city. There was strong enthusiasm for much greater and systematic support for community gardens from local governments around the country. Respondents valued community gardens for their contributions to dietary health, mental well-being, and gathering spaces, as this gardener from Victoria commented. The young Melburnian gardener reflected on the difficulty of getting council support for water access and what a difference that support would have made to her. The vision of there being a community garden within walking distance of everyone is one that I'm sure many of us here this evening would embrace. Imagine having community gardens embedded in council and state government planning frameworks as essential infrastructure in the same way that roads, footpaths and lighting are now. As this experienced gardener from the Mornington Peninsula commented, I would love to see more urban farming. Imagine every new suburb with a designated urban farm space allocated. Fab. Community gardens are often seen as challenges for local council as they can end up being somewhat neglected and look very dishevelled. More models of community gardens where maintenance can be shared between individuals and communities and the council would be great. Together, these represent a powerful emerging vision of Australian cities and towns that are thriving and abundant, full of growing fresh and healthy produce, nourishing and sustaining mind, body and soul. This is both the challenge and the opportunity that COVID-19 has presented to us. So we'll finish now with some final reflections, leaving the last words to the respondents to the Pandemic Gardening Survey. On the pandemic, an experienced gardener from Port Arthur in Tasmania says that it's been a time to reflect, time to realise what actually is important, and time to dig your hands into the soil and produce wonderful, healthy food. Spending time with loving animals, which is so important for mental health. In Melbourne, a younger, since COVID, male gardener says that COVID has disrupted key patterns and habits that were keeping the mesmerised eternal consumption model in place. I feel like I am one of countless others now committed more than ever to the shift towards planetary health, resilience and regeneration. A gardener from the Dandenong Ranges now to Melbourne says that our household is saving over $500 a month on commuting costs and purchased lunches, so we're donating half of that to charity. We are more relaxed and well rested and haven't had any colds all year. I really hope most employers will see the value in allowing most people, no matter what their family status, to continue to work from home long term, at least a couple of days a week. This will result in lower vehicle emissions, less crowded trains and buses, less stressed employees, less sick leave, happier people, more time for connecting with others. Just so many benefits. Capturing the sentiments and experiences of thousands, this experienced gardener from Sydney reflects on what pandemic gardening meant for her. A supply of nutrient-dense, clean, healthy, fresh vegetables. An appreciation that we are part of the interconnected network of life on Earth. A peaceful time, relief from stress and anxiety. A place to go where I feel the sun on my back and the life around me, and it makes me feel better. Entertainment, watching the wildlife in the garden. Mental stimulation from learning and planning. Motivation to get out of bed in the morning and go and see how the garden is going. Satisfaction when things grow and at harvest. Wonderful flavors and experiences, finding new recipes for using the harvested food. The overwhelming sentiment was that this moment represents an extraordinary, once-in-a-generation opportunity to make some profound changes in the direction of a fairer and better Australia. In the words of this experienced gardener from inner Melbourne, to rethink so many aspects of Australian life. She and many other respondents also reminds us that while our attention has been captured by the COVID-19 pandemic, the looming crisis of the climate emergency has not gone away. The devastating fires still raging across the west coast of the United States is a chilling reminder of what we lived through in Australia only 9 or 10 months ago. However, as we've also noted, there was a very strong strain of skepticism expressed by many respondents that this opportunity may pass us by. As this gardener said, I'm afraid our politicians have neither the will nor the capacity to organise such a profound rethink. Similarly, this experienced gardener from out of Perth had no confidence in those she termed the big decision makers. Her strong view was that change is made from the ground up. It will be strong communities, she said, that will guide the trajectory to a better future. You don't need to be growing your own food to show care for the planet. We need all the skills and thinkers to find a better way forward. We'll give the final word here to our Sunshine Coast gardener, who says, throughout it all, I have felt hope. Hope that the momentum of getting back to nature, sustainability and food security would remain after COVID-19. Of course, people will go back to the previous ways of doing things, but the seed of an idea that things can be simpler, I think it takes all of us working on this better, fairer and more sustainable society to continue sharing what we are doing and why. So with that, we'll conclude this evening's presentation, and we'll now throw it open for discussions, questions. There's been many in the chat as we've been going forward. So we'll take those now. We've got about 30 or so minutes. We hope to see you all again back for our webinar on the 9th of October, when we'll be looking at the policy, program and resource implications of this survey. And if you have enjoyed tonight's presentation and you support the work of Sustain, I'd encourage you to consider becoming members and support our work and strengthen our voice for a better food system for all Australians. Thank you very much indeed.